In 1600 Japan, one bowl of rice could mean the difference between life and death, and what you ate told the world exactly who you were. Japan in 1600 was a nation emerging from a century of war, hungry, exhausted, and on the verge of the most extraordinary culinary transformation in its history. The Japanese diet in 1600 looked simple, but inside that simplicity was a philosophy of food so sophisticated it still shapes world cuisine today. 5 classes of people: emperor, nobility, samurai, merchants, and peasants. Each ate differently, lived differently, and thought about food in completely different ways. 90% of Japan's population were farmers, and the food they grew, they were often forbidden by law to eat. This is the story of food in Japan in 1600. From the emperor's gilded dining hall to the mud floor hut of a peasant family scraping rice husks into soup. Rice was not just food in 1600 Japan. It was currency, status, religion, and survival, all in one grain. The entire Japanese feudal economy ran on rice, called koku. A daimyo's wealth, a samurai's salary, a farmer's taxes, all measured in rice. Cooking rice was the most important act of the Japanese household, done twice daily, timed carefully, treated with a respect bordering on reverence. White polished rice, called hakumai, was the ultimate status symbol. Only the wealthy could afford it. The poor ate brown rice, millet, or worse. Most peasants in 1600 ate a thin rice gruel called kayu, stretched with millet, barley, or dried vegetables to feed more mouths with less grain. The difference between rice gruel and white rice was the difference between poverty and power. And most Japanese people of 1600 knew only the gruel. Rice was also the source of sake, the rice wine that lubricated every ceremony, every alliance, every samurai's courage before battle. The gods of Japan were fed rice first. Every harvest festival, every wedding, every prayer began with an offering of rice to the kami, the divine spirits. At harvest time, everything stopped. Every able body in the village, men, women, children, worked the fields from before dawn until dark, knowing that what they gathered was largely not theirs to keep. In 1600, a samurai could buy rice he would never cook. A farmer could grow rice he was forbidden to eat. This was not just economics. It was the entire social order, rendered in grain. A samurai ate with discipline. The warrior code of Bushido extended to the table. Meals were taken in silence, quickly, and without excessive pleasure. Umeboshi, the small, intensely sour pickled plum, was a samurai staple. It was believed to purify the blood, sharpen the mind, and preserve rice from spoiling on campaign. On campaign, samurai carried onigiri, rice balls wrapped in dried seaweed, tucked into their armor. Simple, portable, life-sustaining fuel for men who might fight and die in the same afternoon. The onigiri was perhaps the most democratic food in samurai Japan, a form that crossed class lines, from the humblest foot soldier to the highest general. Shape and filling defined status. The form was universal. The highest samurai ate not from hunger, but from ceremony. The ritual meal called honjin ryori, where every dish, every placement, every timing carried meaning in the warrior hierarchy. A samurai's morning began before food, with practice, prayer, and preparation. Eating came after, because to eat well was not a pleasure but a duty to the body that served the Lord. Dried bonito, katsuobushi, was essential in the samurai kitchen. Shaved into curls and dissolved in water, it made dashi broth, the invisible foundation of almost every samurai dish. Miso soup was eaten at every meal by every samurai every day, morning, midday, and evening. It was warmth, protein, umami, and ritual, all in one bowl. The great lords, the daimyo, maintained professional kitchens staffed by trained cooks whose knowledge of food was itself a form of samurai service. Sake, warm, carefully presented, was the language of alliance and trust between warriors. To share sake with a samurai was to share his world. To refuse was an insult that could require an apology in blood. For the peasant majority of Japan in 1600, the evening meal was the most important moment of the day. The reward for brutal labor, the gathering of family, the small warmth in a hard life. A peasant woman's kitchen held the survival knowledge of generations. How to stretch rice with other grains, how to preserve vegetables for winter, how to make something nutritious from almost nothing. Daikon radish was the peasant vegetable, cheap, abundant, nourishing, and endlessly versatile. Eaten fresh, pickled, dried, stewed, or shredded, it appeared in some form at almost every peasant meal. Millet, called kibi, was the peasant grain when rice ran out. Coarser, less sweet, less prestigious, but calorie-dense and filling enough to fuel another day of labor in the fields. The village market was where peasants traded what they grew and bought what they couldn't make themselves: tofu, salt, dried fish, and the occasional small luxury of fresh vegetables from another valley. Every peasant family made their own miso, fermenting soybeans and salt for months or years. The taste of miso was the taste of home, and every family's version was slightly different. A peasant family of 6 might share a single small fish between them, or none at all. The protein coming instead from miso, from tofu, from beans that cost less than anything that swam or walked. Natto, fermented soybeans, famous for their pungent smell and sticky strings, was peasant protein, cheap, nutritious, and easily made by wrapping soybeans in rice straw and leaving them in winter cold, an acquired taste that fed millions. When fields and stores ran low, the Japanese forest-fed people. Wild mountain vegetables, called sansai, were gathered every spring. Fiddlehead ferns, bamboo shoots, wild garlic, mushrooms. Free food, if you knew where to look. Fresh bamboo shoots, takenoko, announced spring with more certainty than any calendar. Dug from the soil the moment they appeared, cooked the same day to preserve their sweetness, they were one of the great seasonal celebrations of the peasant kitchen. In a world without gas or electricity, the fuel to cook food required as much labor as the food itself. Wood gathered from forests, charcoal made from burning, the fire maintained with constant attention. Mochi, pounded glutinous rice, was the food of celebration. Made at New Year, at weddings, at festivals, the rhythmic pounding of the mortar was the sound of joy in a village. Even the poorest family saved rice to make mochi when celebration demanded it. Japan is an island nation, and in 1600, the sea was the most important kitchen in the country, feeding millions who lived too far from rice paddies to grow their own food. Japan's coastal markets came alive before sunrise, fish vendors competing to sell the freshest catch before the day's heat could change it from treasure to waste. In 1600, sushi was nothing like what we know today. It was narazushi, fish preserved by lactic acid fermentation in cooked rice, sometimes for months or years. Intense, funky, and powerful, the rice was often thrown away. Salt-dried and salt-packed fish made the ocean's abundance available to people hundreds of miles inland. A dried mackerel from the coast might travel weeks by cart and river to reach a mountain village. Cormorant fishing, ukai, was not just a food-gathering method but an art performed on rivers across Japan, where trained birds dove for fish at night, guided by their master's lantern in the darkness. Grilled fish on skewers, yakizakana, was the great equalizer of the Japanese table. Cheap, portable, delicious, it was eaten by everyone from the lowest laborer to the most refined courtier, distinguished only by what kind of fish. Sea bream, tai, was Japan's fish of ceremony. Its red scales meant good luck, its elegant shape meant celebration. A whole grilled tai presented on a formal tray was the highest form of fish hospitality. The ama, female freedivers, were legendary figures in coastal Japan. Diving without equipment to depths that would stop most people's hearts, they harvested abalone, sea urchin, and shellfish that graced the tables of lords. Clam miso soup, hamaguri no miso shiru, was so beloved in coastal Japan that it appears in the oldest surviving Japanese cookbooks. The ocean's salinity meeting the earth's fermented beans in a single bowl. Bluefin tuna, maguro, was already the king of fish in 1600, though it was not yet the global luxury it would become. The great tuna of Japan's coastal waters were celebrated in art, poetry, and on the most prestigious tables. Raw fish, what would become sashimi, was already being served in refined Japanese kitchens by 1600, the freshness of the fish, its own seasoning, salt, and simplicity honoring the ingredient's quality. The sea gave Japan everything it couldn't grow: protein, fat, minerals, and the briny depth of flavor, umami, that would one day become recognized as one of the 5 fundamental tastes. Fermentation was the invisible genius of Japanese cuisine, transforming cheap soybeans and salt into miso, soy sauce, and vinegar, adding depths of flavor that no fresh ingredient alone could provide. Miso was not one flavor but hundreds, light and sweet in Kyoto, dark and intense in the north, red and punchy in the east. Every region, every maker, every year produced something slightly different. Miso was alive. Tamari, the liquid pressed from miso, was the precursor of modern soy sauce. In 1600 it was collected carefully, prized for its salty umami richness, used drop by drop to season the finest dishes. Tofu, made from soybeans, water, and a mineral coagulant, was introduced from China, but claimed completely by Japan. In 1600 it was the protein of the common people, cheap, nutritious, versatile. A tofu maker's day began at 2 in the morning, grinding, boiling, pressing, setting, so that fresh tofu could be carried through the streets by dawn, the wooden blocks still warm and trembling. "Tofu ya!" The tofu vendor's call echoing through morning streets was one of the defining sounds of Japanese urban life, as reliable as the dawn itself. Nukazuki, vegetables pickled in fermented rice bran, were the third element of every Japanese meal alongside rice and miso soup. Crisp, sour, probiotic, they were made in a crock that never emptied, never rested, and was fed and stirred like a pet. The art of preservation was the art of survival in pre-refrigeration Japan. A family's pickle crock, sake supply, and miso barrel were as important to winter survival as the rice in the granary. Dashi, the foundational stock of Japanese cooking, was made from kombu seaweed and dried bonito. Its magic ingredient was glutamic acid, the naturally occurring compound that coats the tongue with richness. Japan discovered umami 300 years before science named it. Kombu, dried kelp, was Japan's most important invisible ingredient. Harvested in cold northern waters, dried on beaches, packed in bales, and carried by ship along the Kombu Highway to kitchens across the country. At the imperial court in Kyoto, food was no longer sustenance. It was art, politics, and theater, designed to demonstrate that those who ate it were closer to heaven than to earth. The court cuisine of Kyoto, called daishokyo, was governed by rules as strict as any ceremony. Color, season, texture, balance. Every element of every dish had to honor the aesthetic principle of ma, meaningful space and restraint. Kaiseki, the multiple-course meal that became the most refined expression of Japanese food culture, was in its early form in 1600. A meal of many small dishes, arriving slowly, each one a meditation on a single ingredient. The philosophy of Japanese noble cuisine was not abundance but precision. One perfect ingredient, prepared with complete attention, presented at the exact moment of its seasonal perfection. The chefs of the imperial court trained for decades. A court cook's knife skills, his knowledge of seasonality and flavor combinations, his ability to present food as visual art, all were considered as refined as any artistic discipline. In the imperial tradition, the garnish was as important as the food. A maple leaf chosen for its color, a pine needle placed as a needle of winter. The season itself was served alongside every dish. The tea ceremony, chado, transformed eating and drinking into philosophy. The simple act of preparing and receiving a bowl of green tea became a practice of awareness, humility, and the appreciation of transience. Matcha, powdered green tea, was not a drink in 1600 Japan. It was a state of mind, consumed in the tea ceremony with the concentration most people brought only to prayer or combat. Among the noble and warrior class, food was diplomacy. To send the right delicacy to a lord at the right season, the first bonito of summer, the first matsutake mushroom of autumn, was a message of loyalty as clear as any written word. Matsutake mushrooms, pine mushrooms, were the diamonds of the Japanese food world. Their intense woody fragrance and their association with autumn made them objects of desire that commanded extraordinary prices even in 1600. Buddhism had profoundly shaped Japanese food by 1600. Its prohibition on killing meant that an entire cuisine had developed around vegetables, tofu, and seafood, a tradition called shojin ryori, or the cuisine of devotion. Shojin ryori was not just vegetarian cooking, it was a practice of gratitude. Every ingredient accepted for what it was, every seed of waste forbidden, every meal a form of meditation on the gift of food. Burdock root, gobo, was medicine before it was food. Its deep, earthy flavor and its toughness made it a challenge that Buddhist cooks turned into a virtue, a root that had to be worked at yielding something rich and complex. Temple vegetable gardens were the laboratories of Japanese food culture, where monks experimented with preservation, fermentation, and preparation of vegetables in ways that would eventually reach the tables of samurai and lords. Fried tofu, agadashi, was one of the great innovations of Buddhist temple cooking. Plain tofu transformed by hot oil and dashi into something with golden edges and silken center. Flavor from nothing, complexity from simplicity. Eggplant dengaku, grilled eggplant with sweet miso, was a dish that appeared equally in Buddhist temple kitchens and samurai feasts. The sweet fermented miso on the charred vegetable, a flavor so complete it needed nothing else. Konnyaku, the rubbery gray blocks made from devil's tongue root, had almost no flavor and almost no calories. In Buddhist cuisine, this was a virtue. Its texture, its ability to absorb surrounding flavors, made it a kind of spiritual sponge. Yuba, the skin of soy milk, was the luxury version of tofu. Delicate, pale, impossibly fragile, with a concentrated richness that made it a delicacy at temple feasts and noble banquets alike. Fu, wheat gluten shaped into decorative forms, was one of the most refined expressions of the Buddhist kitchen. Shaped like autumn leaves, spring blossoms, or harvest moons, it brought beauty to a meal that cost almost nothing to make. Hijiki seaweed, harvested, dried, and simmered with vegetables and sweet soy, was considered such essential nutrition by the Japanese that Buddhist texts recommended it as food for monks maintaining long fasting practices. Osaka, Tenka no Daidokoro, was called the kitchen of all Japan, the city where merchants grew richer than samurai and where the best eating in the country was done, without apology, by people who could afford to pay for it. Soba, buckwheat noodles, was becoming the fast food of Japan's growing cities in 1600, served by street vendors who could ladle a bowl in seconds, the customer eating standing before moving on. Fast, filling, and for the first time, delicious for the masses. The first restaurants in Japan, simple establishments selling cooked food to paying customers, were emerging in the cities of 1600. The idea that someone outside your household would cook your dinner was radical and utterly new. Tempura arrived with Portuguese missionaries in the 16th century and was claimed so completely by Japan that today most people don't know its origins. By 1600, the technique of light batter frying was already being refined into the masterpiece it would become. Dango, sweet rice flour dumplings on a skewer, were Japan's most beloved street snack at temples and festivals. Simple, cheap, satisfying, and sold everywhere that people gathered in celebration. Yakitori, grilled chicken on skewers, was becoming the meat of the people in 1600 Japan. Cheap, portable, delicious, and infinitely satisfying, cooked by the roadside and eaten in 1 or 2 bites. Rich merchants in 1600 Japan occupied an interesting position. They could afford better food than many samurai, but were officially ranked below them in the social hierarchy. Their food was quietly magnificent, the most satisfying cooking done by people with money and no one to impress but themselves. Zosui, rice porridge made from yesterday's rice and fresh dashi, was the meal that demonstrated a household's real cooking skill. Nothing wasted, everything transformed, the economy of the kitchen elevated to art. The merchants of Osaka and Kyoto made food their business in a way the samurai never could, and the peasants never dared. They imported ingredients, funded brewers, tasted and traded, building the commercial food infrastructure that would feed Japan for centuries. The merchant class developed a cuisine of exquisite constraint, taking the cheapest ingredients and making them extraordinary through skill, because they had both the money to pay good cooks and the cultural sensibility to appreciate their work. Every major moment of Japanese life in 1600 was marked by specific food: birth, marriage, New Year, death, each season's first harvest. Food was not just sustenance but the language through which life's meaning was expressed. New Year's osechi was the most important meal of the Japanese year, prepared days in advance so no cooking need be done during the sacred first days, each ingredient carrying a prayer for the year ahead. Cherry blossom season brought hanami, the flower viewing feast. Families and friends spread mats beneath the trees with sake, pickled vegetables, onigiri, and sakura mochi, celebrating not the food, but the beauty of impermanence that the flowers embodied. Festival food was its own category, sweeter, richer, more colorful than everyday eating. The foods sold at shrine festivals were luxuries that many Japanese ate only a few times a year, making each festival a memory made of taste. Rice, sake, and salt, the three sacred foods of Shinto. In 1600, these were offered at every shrine, every ceremony, every act of prayer. Food was the primary language of communication between humans and their gods. Hatsumono, the first of a season's harvest, was celebrated in Japan with an enthusiasm bordering on religious. The first bonito, the first bamboo shoot, the first eggplant. To eat them was to consume the energy of the new season itself. The bento box, the art of preparing a beautiful, complete meal in a portable container, was already a sophisticated form in 1600, the arrangement of food in layers as much an aesthetic act as a practical one. Winter in 1600, Japan was the test of everything a household had preserved, fermented, and stored. The pickled vegetables, the dried fish, the miso, the rice, all the summer's labor compressed into the months when nothing grew. Motenai, the profound Japanese sense of regret for waste, governed every kitchen in 1600. Vegetable trimmings became soup stock. Leftover rice became porridge or gruel. The seed of the fish that had been eaten became fertilizer for next year's crop. Japan in 1600 was a country that had turned the necessity of feeding itself into one of the most refined food cultures in human history, making art from rice, philosophy from tea, and religion from the simple act of eating together. A single bowl of rice. It was currency and prayer, politics and poetry, the measure of a man's worth and the test of his mercy. In Japan in 1600, what you ate was who you were. And the question that history leaves us is, what does what we eat say about who we are today? Tell us in the comments.